In a sleepy English village, a single whispered confession behind a green curtain unleashes a storm of poison, pistols, and buried sins. An elderly spinster hears 3 deadly words, the poison, Tuesday, and watches a priest choke on cyanide-laced coffee, then a colonel fall to a staged suicide. 2 women, 1 fortune, 1 30-year-old murder in Simla. In 7 days and 2 graves, Miss Marple unravels a trap of cyanide, typewriters, and white feathers before the 3rd Tuesday claims another life. Chapter I. The Quiet of St. Mary Mead. St. Mary Mead lay under a pale October sky, the sort of sky that seems to press the village closer to the earth, as if to remind it of its smallness. The church clock struck 10 with the measured solemnity of 4 centuries, and Miss Jane Marple, punctual as ever, closed the gate of her little garden in the High Street, and set off towards the Lich Gate. She wore her usual dove-grey coat and a neat felt hat secured by a pearl pin. Her umbrella, though the morning was dry, hung from her arm like a faithful dog. The churchyard path was carpeted with fallen leaves, bronze and rust, that crackled softly under her sensible shoes. She paused to exchange greetings with old Mr. Pauk, who was trimming the grass around the war memorial with a pair of shears older than himself. He touched his cap. "Morning, Miss Marple. Fine day for the Mothers' Union." "Indeed, Mr. Pauk, though I fear Mrs. Price Ridley will be late again. Her rheumatism is troublesome." She passed on, noting with the precision of long habit that the south door stood ajar unusual before the vergers' arrival, and that a thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney of the vicarage, though Father Brennan was not a man for early fires. Inside the church the air was cool and smelled faintly of damp stone and beeswax. The stained glass window above the altar threw colored lozenges across the flagstones, ruby, sapphire, a sullen emerald. Miss Marple slipped into her accustomed pew near the font, laid her gloves and prayer book on the ledge, and allowed her gaze to travel the familiar aisles. Everything was in order hassocks, neatly aligned, hymnals in their racks, yet something disturbed the quiet. The green curtain of the confessional, that relic of a more Catholic past, was drawn across the little box in the north transept. A murmur of voices reached her, low and hurried, the words indistinguishable except for a sudden clarity. "The poison, Tuesday." The man's voice, unmistakably. Miss Marple did not turn her head. She had long ago learned that the appearance of inattention is often the best observation. The latticework threw a fretwork of shadow across the stone floor, and she watched the play of light as the penitent shifted his knees. Then the curtain was thrust aside with a rasp of rings, and Colonel Lucius Prothero emerged. He was a tall man, still soldierly despite the stoop of 65 years. But this morning his face had the unhealthy pallor of one who has not slept. His mustache, once fiercely waxed, drooped. His eyes, pale blue and prominent, darted about the empty nave as though expecting pursuit. He did not see Miss Marple, half hidden by the pillar. He strode down the side aisle, boots ringing on the stones, and disappeared through the south door, leaving it to swing shut behind him with a thud that echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. A moment later Father Brennan followed. The priest was younger than his parishioners expected, barely 40, with the dark hair and ascetic features of his Irish forebears. He carried a breviary, but his fingers worried the marker ribbon as though it were a rosary. Catching sight of Miss Marple, he composed his features into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Good morning, Miss Marple. You are early. For the Mothers' Union, Father. Though I see you have already had one visitor." He glanced towards the confessional as if surprised it was still there. "A troubled soul," he said. "The seal binds me, as you know." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "Yet troubles shared are troubles halved. They say, though, in this case, perhaps not." Father Brennan's hand tightened on the breviary. "Some burdens are not meant to be lightened by gossip, even kindly meant." Miss Marple inclined her head. Gossip is a weed, Father, but observation is a flower. I merely noticed that Colonel Prothero left in some haste. The priest opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. He made the sign of the cross absently, more habit than devotion, and moved towards the vestry. Miss Marple watched him go, then rose and walked softly to the confessional. The curtain still trembled from its recent disturbance. She did not draw it aside. Instead, she stood where the colonel had stood, and listened. The church was silent now, yet the air seemed to hold an echo of agitation, like the vibration of a plucked string. Outside, the village was beginning its day. The baker's van rattled past. Mrs. Clement's maid cycled to the vicarage with a basket of eggs. Old Miss Hartnell hurried by with a sheaf of parish magazines, her fox fur askew. None of them glanced at the church, yet each carried a fragment of the morning's strangeness. The colonel's hurried exit, the priest's pale face, the drawn curtain that had not been drawn in years. Miss Marple returned to her pew. She picked up her gloves, smoothed them, and considered. In St. Mary Mead, as in human nature everywhere, the smallest deviation from routine was a signpost. Colonel Prothero had not attended confession since his confirmation in 1892. Father Brennan had never before looked frightened. She closed her prayer book with a soft snap. The Mothers' Union could wait. The pattern was already forming, thread by delicate thread, and Miss Marple had always been an excellent knitter. Chapter 2. The village ticks over. By 12:30, the news had traveled the length of the high street, with the neat precision of a shuttle in a loom. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose rheumatism never prevented her from being first with any item of interest, encountered Miss Weatherby outside the post office, and delivered her intelligence in a voice pitched exactly to carry to the queue inside. I saw him with my own eyes. Colonel Prothero marching out of the church as though the devil were at his heels, and the curtain still drawn. Father Brennan looked positively ill. Miss Weatherby, who affected a lorgnette, though her sight was excellent, lowered it theatrically. Raised voices, I shouldn't wonder. The colonel has a temper. Remember when he threatened the verger over the hymn numbers? The queue absorbed this, digested it, and passed it on. By the time Miss Marple reached the butcher's for her half-pound of steak, the joint was beyond her means and her digestion. Mr. Dane Calthorpe was already relating the incident to the grocer's wife, embellishing it with the information that the colonel had been seen shaking his fist at the west door. Miss Marple listened, paid for her parcel, and walked on. She had no intention of adding to the embroidery. In St. Mary Mead, gossip was a tapestry woven by many hands, and she preferred to examine the pattern from a distance. At the corner by the War Memorial, she met Dr. Haydock, who was locking his ancient Morris. "Good morning, Doctor. You look as though you have been up half the night." "Mrs. Lestrange's sciatica," he said, pocketing the key. "And before that, the colonel. Telephoned at 11. Wanted something for his nerves. I told him to come to surgery this afternoon." "His nerves," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "He seemed agitated in church." Haydock gave her a sharp glance. "You were there?" "In my usual pew." He left in a hurry. The doctor lowered his voice, though the street was empty save for a boy delivering telegrams. "Between ourselves, he asked me yesterday for a quick-acting poison, said it was for rats in the granary. I refused, naturally. Told him to get a cat." Miss Marple's eyes, pale blue and deceptively mild, rested on his face. "Rats are troublesome," she murmured, "though I have always found that a saucer of milk and a little patience answer better than poison." Haydock grunted and climbed into his car. As he drove off, Miss Marple turned her steps towards the old manor house. The walk took her past the lych gate again. The south door was now closed, and the churchyard lay deserted under the thin sunshine. She paused to read the notice board Harvest Festival, Sunday next, gifts of produce gratefully received, and noted that the verger had forgotten to remove last week's announcement about the jumble sale. Small oversights, she reflected, were often the cracks through which larger truth seeped. The old manor house stood back from the road behind a screen of laurels, its red brick mellowed to the color of damson jam. The Daimler was in the drive, its bonnet still warm. Miss Marple laid a gloved hand on the metal and felt the faint throb of the engine cooling. Through the drawing-room window she glimpsed movement. Anne Protheroe, tall and fair in a green housecoat, standing by the mantelpiece with a letter in her hand. The envelope was pale blue, the shade favored by Lettice Protheroe for her infrequent communications from London. Anne's attitude was rigid, as though she had been arrested in the act of opening it. Miss Marple did not linger. She continued to the gate, lifted the latch with the soft click that denoted good manners, and walked up the gravel path. The maid who answered her ring was new polish, with a wary expression and imperfect English. "Mrs. Protheroe is not at home," she recited. "Dear me," said Miss Marple, "and I particularly wish to return this library book. Perhaps you would give it to her with my compliments." The maid hesitated, then stood aside. Miss Marple stepped into the hall, which smelled of beeswax and the particular staleness of old houses that are too large for their occupants. From the drawing-room came the rustle of paper being thrust hastily into a drawer. Anne Protheroe appeared in the doorway, the green housecoat buttoned to the throat, though the day was mild. Her smile was bright and mechanical. "Miss Marple, how kind. Do come in." The drawing-room was overfurnished in the fashion of the late King Emperor. Velvet curtains the color of claret, a Kabul rug, a profusion of occasional tables bearing silver photograph frames. The blue letter was no longer visible. In its place on the blotter lay a single white feather, curved like a scimitar. Anne saw Miss Marple's glance, and swept the feather into a drawer with a quick, almost guilty movement. "Tea?" she asked. "Or sherry? Lucius is out walking, I believe." Miss Marple declined both. "I only came to return Mr. Kipling's Kim. The Colonel lent it to me last month. Such a vivid picture of India." Anne's fingers twisted the jade beads at her throat. "He was there for years, of course. Before we married." There was a silence. Outside, a gardener began to clip the yew hedge with methodical snicks. Miss Marple seated herself on the edge of a tapestry chair. "You seem troubled, my dear," she said gently. "Is it the Colonel's health?" Anne gave a brittle laugh. "His health is excellent. His temper less so. He quarreled with Father Brennan last week, something about the churchyard fund. Everyone heard him threaten to shoot the poor man. Words spoken in anger," Miss Marple murmured, "are like feathers released to the wind. They travel far." Anne's eyes widened. "You think he meant it?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that Colonel Protheroe is a man who has spent his life giving orders. When orders are questioned, he reacts strongly. But murder," she allowed the word to hang in the air like incense. "Murder requires more than temper. It requires planning." The maid appeared with a tray despite the refusal. Thin bread and butter, a Dundee cake, a silver teapot that steamed gently. Anne poured with unsteady hands. Miss Marple accepted a cup and sipped. "Lettice is here, I believe?" "For a few days. She arrived yesterday." Anne's voice sharpened. "She and her father do not always see eye to eye. Stepdaughters seldom do," Miss Marple observed. "Especially when there is money." Anne set down her cup with a clatter. "There is the estate, of course. But Lucius made a new will last year. Everything to me." Miss Marple noted the emphasis. "How wise. Though wills can be changed. Not this one," Anne said quickly. "It is in the bank." "Ironclad," the solicitor said. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 1. From the garden came the sound of raised voices. The Colonel's bark, unmistakable, and a lighter, younger tone lettuce, perhaps. Anne rose. "I must see what that is. Will you excuse me?" Miss Marple stood also. "Of course. Thank you for the tea." She walked slowly down the path, pausing to admire a late rose. The voices had ceased. The Daimler's bonnet, was now quite cold. At the gate she met Lettice Prothero coming in, a striking girl in a scarlet coat, her dark hair wind-blown. "Miss Marple, have you been visiting the stepmamma?" "Returning a book," Miss Marple replied. "Your father is fond of Kipling." Lettice laughed, a sound without mirth. "He's fond of many things, most of them expensive." She swept past, leaving a trace of French perfume and something sharper fear, perhaps, or defiance. Miss Marple watched her go, then continued towards the village. At the Blue Boar, she paused for a glass of milk and a word with the landlord's wife, who was slicing ham with the concentration of a surgeon. "Colonel in a rare taking this morning," Mrs. Burt confided. "Came in for a brandy at 11, never touches it before luncheon. Said he'd had a shock." "Indeed?" Miss Marple sipped her milk. "A shock can be beneficial. It wakes one up." Mrs. Burt leaned closer. "Young Dennis from the garage saw him at the church earlier. Said the colonel looked fit to murder someone." Miss Marple finished her milk and paid. Outside, the afternoon was fading into a soft golden haze. She walked home past the vicarage, where Father Brennan's Austin was drawn up at the door. The priest stood on the step, speaking to the curate, Mr. Clement, a pale young man with a nervous stammer. "Tuesday, then," Father Brennan was saying. "And Thursday, as usual." Mr. Clement nodded and pedaled away on his bicycle. Father Brennan saw Miss Marple and lifted a hand in greeting, but his smile was strained. Miss Marple let herself into her cottage, hung up her hat, and sat down to think. The threads were there: the colonel's agitation, the drawn curtain, the mention of poison, the blue letter, the white feather, the quarrel overheard by half the village. In St. Mary Mead, as in the greater world, nothing happened in isolation. Each action touched another, like ripples in a pond. She took out her knitting, a baby's jacket in pale yellow wool, and began to count stitches. The pattern was forming, but it was not yet complete. Tuesday, she reflected, was only 4 days away. Chapter 3. Tuesday Comes. Tuesday broke with a wind that rattled the casements of St. Mary Mead and sent the last leaves skittering along the gutters like startled birds. Miss Marple rose early, drew back her bedroom curtains, and saw the church tower standing black against a sky the color of pewter. She dressed with her usual care: a tweed skirt, a cardigan the shade of heather, a brooch of Whitby jet, then went downstairs to brew tea and toast a slice of yesterday's loaf. The postman brought one letter only, a charity appeal from the Distressed Gentlewomen's Aid. She laid it aside and opened her Bible at the Psalms, but her mind was not on the verses. At 8:30, she put on her outdoor things and walked to the church. The wind had dropped. The air was cold and still, the sort of stillness that makes every footstep sound conspiratorial. The south door stood open as usual, but the nave was empty. Miss Marple slipped into her pew, laid her prayer book on the ledge, and waited. The confessional curtain was drawn once more, yet no penitent knelt within. The lattice showed only darkness. She could hear the faint tick of the sacristy clock, and farther off, the clink of milk bottles as the boy from the dairy made his rounds. At 9 o'clock the verger, Mr. Hawes, arrived to ring the bell for early service. He was a small, round man with a permanent expression of grievance, and he greeted Miss Marple with a nod that managed to convey both respect and suspicion. "Morning, ma'am. Father's not here yet." "Overslept, I shouldn't wonder." "He is usually punctual," Miss Marple observed. Hawes sniffed. "Irish time, they call it. Though he's been jumpy these last days. Kept looking over his shoulder like—" He disappeared into the bell tower. Miss Marple remained where she was. At 9:15, the vicarage maid Gladys came hurrying across the churchyard, her apron flapping. She burst through the door, saw Miss Marple, and let out a small shriek. "Oh, miss!" "It's Father Brennan. He's in there." She pointed a trembling finger at the confessional. "Mrs. Archer found him." "She's gone for the doctor." Miss Marple rose. "Show me." Gladys led her down the side aisle. The curtain was still drawn, but a corner had been pulled aside. Father Brennan sat slumped against the wooden partition, his head fallen forward, the breviary open on his knee. His face was bluish, the lips parted as though in mid-sentence. On the narrow ledge before him stood a cup and saucer vicarage china, pale green with a gold rim. The cup was half full of coffee, and a faint, unmistakable odor rose from it, bitter almonds. Miss Marple did not touch the body. She had seen death before, in cottage bedrooms and on battlefields, glimpsed through ambulance windows, and she recognized the stillness that comes when the spirit has fled. She turned to Gladys, who was crying into her apron. "Run and fetch Inspector Craddock from Loch Benham. Tell him it is urgent. Then ask Dr. Haydock to come at once." Gladys fled. Miss Marple drew the curtain fully across, as though decency required it, and stood guard until the doctor arrived 10 minutes later. Haydock took one look, lifted the priest's wrist, and let it fall. "Dead 2 hours at least. Cyanide, I'd stake my reputation. Prussic acidax in seconds." He sniffed the cup and recoiled. Enough in there to kill a dozen men. Behind them, the church door banged. Mrs. Archer, the cleaner, stood on the threshold, clutching a duster like a flag of surrender. She was a large woman with a voice to match. "I only left him for 5 minutes. Brought his coffee at 8:30, same as always. He was alive, then said thank you. Polite as you please." Haydock straightened. "Who else was here?" "Nobody. Door was locked till I came." Though she hesitated. "There's a side door by the vestry. Anyone could slip in." Miss Marple spoke for the first time. "The cup was sent from the vicarage?" Gladys, returning breathless, confirmed it. "Cook made it fresh. Father liked it strong, with a spoonful of sugar. I carried it over myself." Haydock examined the saucer. "No sugar here. And the cup's been wiped, fingerprints smudged. The church was filling now. The verger, the curate, a knot of early worshippers drawn by the commotion." Miss Marple moved among them, murmuring reassurance, noting who arrived first and who lingered by the door. Colonel Prothero was not among them. Nor was Anne, nor Lettuce. Inspector Craddock arrived at 11, driven from Much Benham in a black Wolseley that scattered gravel like hail. He was tall, thin, and precise, with the air of a man who trusted science more than intuition. He greeted Miss Marple with the wary courtesy reserved for elderly ladies who knew too much. "Poison again," he said, after Haydock's report, "and in a church. The press will love this." He set his men to work. Photographs, fingerprints, a search of the vestry and the priest's tiny office. The coffee pot from the vicarage was sealed in a jar. The sugar bowl was found to contain nothing but sugar. Miss Marple watched from her pew, her hands folded in her lap. At noon Craddock interviewed the household. Gladys repeated her story, tears giving way to indignation at the suggestion that vicarage coffee could be poisonous. Cook, a formidable woman named Mrs. Bunch, swore the pot had been washed clean the night before and filled from a fresh packet that morning. The curate, Mr. Clement, admitted he had seen Father Brennan at breakfast nervous, picking at his toast, mentioning a difficult confession. "Difficult?" Craddock pressed. Mr. Clement flushed. "The seal, Inspector." "I can say no more." Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "You were here early, Mom. Did you see anyone?" "I arrived at 8:30, she replied. The church was empty. The curtain was drawn, but no one knelt inside. At 9 the bell rang, and shortly after, Gladys brought the cup. Craddock made a note. The poison must have been added between 8:30 and 8:45. Someone knew the priest's routine. Miss Marple inclined her head. Father Brennan heard confessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The cup was a gift trusted, familiar. A clever murderer would substitute it for the usual one. Clever, Craddock repeated. Or desperate. He dismissed the villagers and sealed the church. Miss Marple walked home through the churchyard, pausing to read the inscriptions on the older stones. One caught her eye. Lucius Prothero, 1919 to 1944, killed in Burma. The colonel's only son, dead at 25. She remembered the white feather on Anne's blotter and the tremor in the woman's hand. At her gate, she met Dr. Haydock again, his bag in his hand. "Post-mortem this afternoon," he said. "But it's clear enough. Hydrocyanic acid, probably potassium cyanide dissolved in the coffee. Instantaneous." Miss Marple nodded. "The colonel asked you for poison." Haydock's eyes narrowed. "He did. And now the priest is dead? Coincidence?" "In St. Mary Mead," said Miss Marple, "there are no coincidences. Only patterns." She went indoors, hung up her coat, and sat down to write a list in her neat, slanting hand. Colonel Prothero in church last week confession? Mention of poison overheard. Cup brought at 8:35 poisoned by 8:45. White feather cowardice? Or threat? Tuesday chosen deliberately. She underlined the last line twice. Somewhere in the village, a clock struck one. The wind had risen again. It moaned in the chimney like a soul in torment. Miss Marple closed her notebook and reached for her knitting. The yellow wool slipped through her fingers, smooth and innocent, while her mind moved among darker threads. Tuesday had come, and with it the first death. She had no doubt there would be another. Chapter 4. The Family. The inquest on Father Brennan was held in the village hall on Thursday morning, the room smelling of varnish and damp umbrellas. The coroner, a retired solicitor from Much Benham, sat beneath a portrait of Queen Victoria and adjusted his pince-nez with the air of a man who preferred fishing to human tragedy. Dr. Haydock gave his evidence briskly. Death by prussic acid poisoning, administered between 8:30 and 8:45, the cup the vehicle. Inspector Craddock described the scene, the sealed church, the absence of fingerprints save those of the priest and the vicarage maid. Gladys wept into a handkerchief. Mrs. Archer declared that she had cleaned the confessional the previous afternoon and seen nothing amiss. The Prothero family occupied the front bench like defendants in the dock. Colonel Prothero sat rigid, his face the color of putty, staring straight ahead. And beside him twisted a lace handkerchief until the threads gave way. Lettuce, in black that became her dramatically, smoked a cigarette in a long amber holder and looked bored. When the coroner asked the colonel to account for his movements on Tuesday morning, his reply came in the clipped tones of the parade ground. "I rose at 7, walked the dog, breakfasted at 8. At 10:30 I entered the church by the south door to apologize to Father Brennan for a remark made in haste the previous week. He was not in the nave. I left immediately. By the same door? By the same door." Anne confirmed that her husband had returned at 11, complaining of a headache. Lettuce said she had taken the pony and trapped to the station at 10 to meet a friend from town who had failed to arrive. She had waited until noon and then driven home. No one corroborated any of it. The jury brought in willful murder, by person or persons unknown, and the hall emptied into a drizzle that turned the high street to mud. Miss Marple attended the inquest but did not give evidence. She sat at the back, her hands folded over her umbrella, and watched the Protheros file out. The colonel's shoulders were bowed. Anne's eyes were red. Lettuce lit another cigarette before she reached the door. Outside, the Daimler stood waiting, its chauffeur polishing the already gleaming paint. Miss Marple noted that the near side wing bore a fresh scratch, as though it had brushed a gatepost. That afternoon she called at the old manor house under pretext of inquiring after the colonel's health. The Polish maid admitted her with reluctance. The hall smelled of damp leaves and the particular staleness that clings to houses where grief has taken up residence. Anne received her in the morning room, a smaller apartment than the drawing room, furnished with chintz and watercolors of the Lake District. A coal fire burned low. The white feather was nowhere to be seen. "You are very kind," Anne said. Her voice was husky, as though she had been crying or shouting. "Lucius is resting." The inquest upset him dreadfully. "Shock affects us all differently," Miss Marple murmured. "Some grow silent, others voluble. Your husband is a silent man, I think." Anne poured tea from a silver pot that trembled in her hand. "He blames himself. That foolish quarrel about the churchyard wall, everyone heard him say he could strangle the priest. Now this, words are not deeds," Miss Marple said, "though sometimes they are taken for deeds." Anne's cup rattled in its saucer. "The police asked about poison. Lucius keeps rat bait in the tools shed arsenic, I believe. They took it away." Miss Marple sipped her tea. It was china, too strong, with a faint metallic taste. "Cyanide is different. Photographers use it, I understand, for fixing solutions." Anne started. "I have a darkroom in the old stable. But the bottle is sealed. Inspector Craddock saw it." "Seals can be broken and remade," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Though I am sure you are in the clear, my dear. Tell me, does Lettice share your interest in photography?" "Lettice?" Anne gave a brittle laugh. "She cares for clothes and nightclubs. She was in the darkroom once, years ago, when she thought it might be amusing. The fumes made her sick." The door opened, and Lettice herself appeared, still in black, but with a scarlet scarf knotted at her throat. She carried a small suitcase. "Leaving us?" Miss Marple inquired. "London," Lettice said. "Funerals tomorrow, but I can't bear this place. Too many ghosts." She glanced at Anne. "Stepmama understands." Anne's lips tightened. "Your father needs you. Papa needs a nurse, not a daughter." Lettice set the case down. "Besides, the police have finished with me. I was at the station, remember? The ticket collector saw me." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the girl's gloves, new, expensive, kid leather the color of butter. "A long wait for a train that never came." Lettice shrugged. "My friend wired from Paddington missed the connection. These things happen." She went out, the scarlet scarf fluttering like a banner. Anne stared after her, then turned to Miss Marple with sudden intensity. "She hates me. She thinks I married Lucius for his money. Perhaps I did. But I have been a good wife 20 years younger. Yes, but faithful. And now this horror." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Money is a sharp motive, but so is fear. Your husband confessed something in church last week. Father Brennan was troubled afterwards. Did the colonel speak to you of it?" Anne's hand flew to her throat. "He said only that he had unburdened his soul. Something from India, long ago. I thought it was the climate, or the war. Men carry such burdens. India," Miss Marple repeated. "A hot country. Fevers, snakes, and sometimes poison." Anne rose abruptly. "I must see if Lucius is awake. Will you excuse me?" Miss Marple walked home through the dripping lanes. The churchyard was deserted. A wreath of chrysanthemums lay on the raw earth of Father Brennan's grave, the card already sodden. She paused at the lych gate and looked back at the old manor house. A curtain twitched in an upper window. Someone was watching. That evening Dr. Haydock called with a bottle of blackcurrant jelly from his housekeeper. "Thought you might fancy it," he said. "And I've news. The colonel's been asking for laudanum, says he can't sleep. I gave him a mild sedative instead." "Guilty conscience?" Miss Marple asked. "Or fear?" He muttered something about Tuesday next, kept repeating it. "I thought he meant the inquest, but that was Thursday." Miss Marple knitted in silence for a moment. "The colonel confessed on the first Tuesday in October. Father Brennan died on the following Tuesday. If there is a pattern," Haydock's face was grim, "you think the murderer will strike again?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that patterns are meant to be completed." She saw the doctor out and returned to her sitting room. On the table lay the library book she had borrowed from the Prothero's Kim, its leather binding cracked with age. She opened it at random and found a pressed violet between the pages, dry and brittle. On the flyleaf, in a girlish hand, was written, Lettuce Prothero, Simla, 1929. Beneath it, in the colonel's angular script, for services rendered. Miss Marple closed the book. Simla, 30 years ago. A child's handwriting, a father's cryptic dedication. She remembered the Aya's tale, whispered in the bazaar. The Mem Sahib who wasted away after eating curry. The major who grieved so convincingly at the funeral. Arsenic leaves no trace in the blood after so long, but memory is another matter. She took out her notebook and added 3 lines. Darkroom cyanide accessible to all. Lettuce in London, 1929, age 15. Colonel's will. Everything to Anne. Then she underlined the word Tuesday and drew a small, precise circle around it. The fire settled in the grate with a soft sigh. Outside, the wind had dropped. The village lay hushed, waiting. Chapter 5. The Second Death. The funeral of Father Brennan took place on a morning of thin November sunshine that did little to warm the mourners gathered in the churchyard. The grave had been dug beside the yew tree, its earth dark and crumbly. A single wreath of white lily lay on the coffin, sent anonymously from Much Benham. The curate, Mr. Clement, read the service in a voice that faltered only once when he came to the words about the secrets of the heart. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the group, her black gloves folded neatly over her prayer book, and observed the Protheros with the detached interest of a naturalist watching birds at a feeder. Colonel Prothero was there, supported by Anne on one side and a Malacca cane on the other. His face had the grayness of old ash, and he stared into the grave as though measuring its depth for himself. Anne wept decorously into a veil. Lettuce, who had postponed her departure to London, stood apart, smoking a cigarette with quick, nervous puffs. Inspector Craddock lingered by the lich gate, notebook in hand, speaking in undertones to Dr. Haydock. The village turned out in force. Mrs. Price Ridley in a fur tippet that had seen better decades. Miss Weatherby with her lorgnette trained on the chief mourners, the verger Hawes shifting from foot to foot as if the grass offended him. When the coffin was lowered, a collective sigh rose like steam from the crowd. Miss Marple noted that the colonel did not throw in his handful of earth. His hand trembled too violently. As the gathering dispersed, she approached Anne. "My condolences, my dear. Such a tragedy for the parish." Anne pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Lucius is taking it badly. He insists on attending the reading of the will this afternoon. Father Brennan witnessed the codicil, you see." Miss Marple inclined her head. A man's last wishes should be respected. She walked home alone, pausing to exchange a word with Dr. Haydock, who was lighting his pipe by the war memorial. "The colonel asked for more sedative this morning," he said. "Said he hadn't slept. I gave him enough for 1 dose, warned him not to mix it with whiskey." "Whiskey and remorse," Miss Marple murmured. "A dangerous combination." Haydock knocked out his pipe. "Remorse? For a quarrel? For more than that, perhaps." She continued to her cottage, where a cold luncheon awaited, a slice of veal pie and a baked apple. She ate without haste, then sat by the fire with her knitting. The yellow wool had grown into the semblance of a sleeve. She counted stitches and considered the pattern. The priest dead on a Tuesday. The colonel agitated, confessing old sins. The family circling like crows over carrion. At 4 o'clock, she looked at the clock and decided on a walk. The village green was empty save for a boy flying a kite that dipped and soared against the pale sky. Miss Marple turned towards the old manor house. The Daimler stood in the drive, but the curtains were drawn in the study window that faced the road. She had intended to borrow another book in the excuse, but something in the stillness of the house deterred her. Instead, she walked on, past the Blue Boar, where the landlord was sweeping the step. "Quiet afternoon," she observed. "Too quiet," he replied. "After the funeral, folk want their tea." But the colonel's chauffeur came in at 3, said the master was resting and not to be disturbed. Miss Marple nodded and proceeded to the church. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of earth and wilting flowers. She genuflected out of habit, then made her way to the confessional. The curtain hung limp and innocent. On impulse, she drew it aside and stepped into the narrow space. The kneeler was worn velvet, the latticework carved with tiny crosses. She knelt, not in prayer, but to examine the floor. There, wedged behind the wooden support, was a scrap of paper, folded small. She teased it out with gloved fingers. The paper was thin, torn from a notebook. The writing was in pencil, hurried but legible. "If he talks, we all hang." It was not the colonel's hand. His was bold and angular, but smaller, more rounded. Miss Marple slipped the note into her handbag and rose. As she emerged, the verger Hawes entered from the vestry, carrying a vase of dead chrysanthemums. "Miss Marple, didn't expect to see you here. I came to arrange the flowers for Sunday," she said mildly. "Though I see you have been beforehand." Hawes dumped the flowers in the bin. "Curate's orders. Clear out the old. By the way, the police returned the priest's effects. Nothing much. A rosary, some letters. All proper." Miss Marple walked home as dusk gathered. At her gate, she met Inspector Craddock, cycling from the direction of the manor. "Evening, ma'am. I've been to see the colonel about that codicil." He was in his study, door locked. Anne said he was sleeping off the funeral. "Sleeping," Miss Marple repeated. "At 4 in the afternoon?" Craddock dismounted. She seemed nervous. "Said he'd taken a powder. I'll call again tomorrow." Miss Marple watched him pedal away, then entered her cottage. She lit the lamp, drew the curtains, and examined the scrap of paper under the light. The pencil was soft, the kind used in offices. The vicarage possessed a typewriter, but this was handwritten. "We all hang." More than one person, then. The Evening Post brought a picture postcard from a former maid in Bournemouth's sunny cliffs, a cheerful message. Miss Marple laid it aside and turned on the wireless for the news. Trouble in Suez, a strike in the mines, the usual litany. At 9 o'clock, she banked the fire and went to bed, but sleep was slow in coming. The wind had risen. It rattled the window like impatient fingers. She woke once, at midnight, to the sound of a car engine in the lane, unusual at that hour. Peering through the curtains, she saw the Daimler's taillights disappearing towards the manor. Someone returning late. Morning brought frost, a glittering rime on the grass that crunched underfoot. Miss Marple rose, dressed, and breakfasted on porridge and tea. At 8:30, the church bell began to toll not the measured peal for service, but a single urgent note repeated. She hurried out, meeting Mrs. Price Ridley at the corner, her face flushed with excitement. "It's the colonel. Found in his study shot. They say suicide." The manor house was already besieged. Constables at the gate. Dr. Haydock's Morris drawn up askew. Villagers clustering like bees. Miss Marple slipped through with the authority of age and respectability. In the hall, Anne stood wringing her hands, her face blotched with tears. Lettice, pale but composed, smoked in the morning-room doorway. Inspector Craddock emerged from the study, his face grim. "Miss Marple, you'd better come in." The room smelled of cordite and whiskey. Colonel Prothero sat slumped over his desk, a service revolver in his right hand, a neat hole in his right temple. Blood had pooled on the blotter, soaking into a sheet of paper. The note was brief, in the colonel's handwriting. "I can no longer live with what I have done." Craddock pointed to the whiskey decanter, half empty, and a glass beside it. Powder residue on his fingers. Classic suicide. Miss Marple approached the desk. The revolver was the colonel's Webley, kept in a drawer. The note was on heavy cream paper, but the lines were unruled. The colonel always used ruled notepaper for correspondence. She glanced at the body. The entry wound was clean, the exit messy, but the hand holding the gun was relaxed, not rigid in death. "I saw him yesterday," she said. At 4 o'clock on the green. He was striding purposefully, said he had business in Much Benham. A man intent on suicide does not make appointments. Craddock frowned. Anne says he came home at 5, went straight to his study, locked the door. She heard the shot at 7, but thought it was a car backfiring. Didn't check until morning. Lettuce spoke from the doorway. Papa was drunk. He often locked himself in with the decanter. Miss Marple turned to her. And you, Miss Prothero? Where were you at 7? In my room, packing. I heard nothing. Dr. Haydock joined them. Time of death between 6 and 8. Whiskey and sedative in the stomach, enough to fell an ox. He wouldn't have been steady enough to write that note. Craddock examined the typewriter on the side-table vicarage model, lent for parish letters. The note's handwritten, but the spacing, Miss Marple said softly. Look at the margins, as though composed on a machine and copied. She opened her handbag and produced the scrap from the confessional. Found this yesterday. Someone feared the colonel would talk. Craddock read it, his jaw tightening. We all hang. More than suicide, then. Anne fainted neatly into a chair. Lettuce stubbed out her cigarette with a twist. Miss Marple looked from one to the other, her mind weaving the threads tighter. The second death had come, not on a Tuesday, but on All Souls' Eve, when the veil between living and dead is thinnest. The pattern was altering, but it was not yet broken. Chapter 6. The pattern. The double inquest was fixed for the following Wednesday. But long before the coroner reassembled his jury, the village had settled upon its verdict. Colonel Prothero, tormented by the murder of Father Brennan, had taken his own life. The note was conclusive. The whiskey explained the tremor in the handwriting. The locked door sealed the argument. Only Inspector Craddock, pacing the police station at Much Benham, with a cigarette that burned unnoticed between his fingers, refused to initial the file. Too neat, he muttered to his sergeant. Too many conveniences. At 4 o'clock on the Monday afternoon, he presented himself at Miss Marple's cottage, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. She admitted him with the courtesy due to a young man who still believed in fingerprints, and set a tray of tea and seed cake between them. You are troubled, Inspector. Troubled? He laughed without humor. I have a priest poisoned in his own confessional, a colonel shot in a locked room, a suicide note that may be forgery, and a household of suspects who contradict one another only when it suits them. Add to that a scrap of paper threatening hanging for plural persons, and I am past troubled into bewilderment. Miss Marple poured tea with the precision of a chemist. Bewilderment is the first stage of clarity. Let us lay out the pieces as one does with a jigsaw. She produced her notebook and turned to a fresh page. Item: Father Brennan died on a Tuesday, the day he heard confessions. The coffee was brought at 8-30-5, poisoned within 10 minutes. Someone knew his routine to the minute. Item: Colonel Prothero confessed the previous Tuesday, something that left the priest pale and distracted. The colonel asked Dr. Haydock for poison the day before the murder. Item: The colonel was killed between 6 and 8 on All Souls' Eve. The study door was locked from within. The key was in the lock. The revolver was his own, kept in the drawer. The note is on his crested paper, but not ruled, though he always used ruled paper. The handwriting slopes differently under a glass. Item: The scrap from the confessional. If he talks, we all hang is in a hand neither the colonel's nor the priest's. It is small, rounded, feminine. Item: Cyanide was accessible in the darkroom. The colonel kept arsenic for rats. Lettuce was seen near the vicarage on Monday evening. Anne poured the colonel's whiskey on the night he died. Craddock stirred his tea violently. Motive? Money, fear, and an old crime. The colonel's first wife died in Simla of what was called fever. Arsenic mimics gastric fever, the ayah suspected. The child Lettuce, then 15, overheard. Father Brennan recognized the symptoms when the colonel unburdened his soul. He intended to inform the authorities, hence the Tuesday appointments. The murderer struck first to silence the priest, then the colonel to prevent further confession. Craddock leaned forward. 2 murderers? Or 1 murderer and an accomplice? The pronoun we is suggestive. Anne inherits everything. Lettuce is disinherited unless Anne dies. Together they remove the obstacle and share the estate. But the locked room, Miss Marple smiled gently. A simple trick. The key turned from the outside with a pair of pliers through the letterbox common in country houses. The revolver placed in a slack hand. The note composed on the vicarage typewriter and copied. Whiskey and sedative to muddle the time of death. Craddock crushed out his cigarette. Evidence? Circumstantial, but cumulative. The white feather cowardice or threat. The blue letter from Lettuce to Anne, destroyed. The scratched wing of the Daimler driven, late at night. And the curate's announcement tomorrow that a second confession, recorded by Father Brennan, has been found in the safe. Craddock stared. There is no such confession. There will be by morning. A blank notebook, a few lines in the priest's hand forgery, is easier when the forger believes the document genuine. Human nature. Inspector is predictable. She rose and fetched a small tin from the mantelpiece. Inside lay the scrap of paper, the pressed violet, a single white feather. Exhibit A, B, and C, the rest is timing. Craddock stood. You propose a trap. I propose justice. Announce the discovery at evensong. Watch who comes to the church tonight. The confessional is the perfect stage. He hesitated. If they bring weapons, your men will be waiting, and I shall be praying in the front pew. Craddock smiled ruefully. You should have been a detective, Miss Marple. I am merely an old maid who knits and notices things. After he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair. The fire had sunk to embers. She added coal with methodical care. Outside, the rain had ceased. A thin moon silvered the garden. She took up her knitting, but did not resume work. Instead, she reviewed the pattern. The priest's routine, the colonel's agitation, the women's fear. In St. Mary Mead, as in the greater world, murder was a duet, seldom a solo. At 7 o'clock, the church bell rang for evensong. Miss Marple donned her mackintosh and galoshes and walked through the damp lanes. The nave was dimly lit. Only a dozen parishioners scattered among the pews. Mr. Clement read the lesson in a voice that shook slightly. At the end of the service, he stepped forward. Before we depart, a word. The police have discovered a notebook in Father Brennan's safe, a second confession, sealed and dated. It will be opened tomorrow in the presence of the coroner. A rustle ran through the congregation like wind in dry leaves. Miss Marple, in the front pew, bowed her head as though in prayer. She heard the door creak, soft footsteps in the aisle, the whisper of silk. Someone had taken the bait? She did not look up until the church was empty. Then she rose and walked to the confessional. The curtain was drawn once more. Inside, a gloved hand held a small pistol. Another clutched a dark lantern. Anne and Lettuce faced each other in the narrow space, white-faced, breathing hard. You little fool, Anne hissed. You wrote the note, and you shot Papa after drugging his whiskey. I only wanted the money. Miss Marple stepped from the shadows. You both wanted the money. And you both heard the colonel confess that he had poisoned his first wife in India arsenic in the curry. Father Brennan recognized the symptoms. He intended to inform the police. Lettuce raised the pistol. Anne lifted the cyanide vial. Neither weapon was fired. 2 constables emerged from the vestry, Craddock behind them. The women were handcuffed with the quiet efficiency of men who have done this before. As they were led away, Anne turned to Miss Marple. How did you know? My dear, said Miss Marple, in a village everyone knows everything eventually. The only question is who acts upon it. The church door closed behind them. Miss Marple remained a moment, looking at the confessional. The green curtain hung limp, the lattice empty. She drew it fully open, letting the moonlight fall upon the kneeler where two murderers had knelt in fear. Outside, the frost was hardening. The stars were sharp as pins. Miss Marple walked home, her footsteps the only sound in the sleeping village. The pattern was complete. Chapter 7. The Trap. The trap was not sprung in the church. That had been the bait, nothing more. Miss Marple had never intended the confessionals to hold the climax. She had watched Anne and Lettuce arrive separately. Anne at 11:20, Lettuce 5 minutes later, both cloaked, both gloved, both carrying small handbags that clicked when set down. They had spoken in whispers, then parted without violence, each believing the other had come to destroy the fictitious notebook. The constables had let them go. Craddock had wanted arrests then and there. Miss Marple had insisted on patience. Guilt is a ferment, she told him as they waited in the vestry, the single lamp throwing long shadows across the stone floor. Let it work. At midnight, the manor house was dark, except for a thin line of light beneath the study door. Anne had dismissed the servants early, pleading headache. Lettuce had retired to a room with a migraine and a hot water bottle. The Daimler stood in the carriage yard, its engine still ticking as it cooled. A constable hidden behind the laurels saw the study window open. A figure in a dark coat slipped out, crossed the lawn, and vanished into the shrubbery. 10 minutes later, the same figure returned by the kitchen door. Craddock's men closed the net at 1 o'clock. They found Anne in the dark room, the cyanide bottle uncorked, a glass dish half filled with clear liquid. Lettuce was in the study, the colonel's revolver cleaned and reloaded, a fresh box of cartridges open on the blotter. Between them on the desk lay the vicarage typewriter and a sheet of cream notepaper ruled with faint blue lines, the colonel's own stationery, stolen weeks before. Anne spoke first, her voice flat with exhaustion. It was meant to look like suicide from the beginning. The priest first, then Lucius. We planned it together. Lettuce laughed, a brittle sound. You planned it. I only agreed because you promised me half the estate once you remarried. When Papa changed his will. Silence, Craddock said. He turned to Miss Marple, who had entered quietly and now stood beside the fireplace, her hands folded in front of her. You anticipated this? I anticipated desperation, she replied. The notebook was a mirage. They came to the church to destroy evidence that did not exist, and in doing so revealed their true intent. Anne needed the darkroom to prepare a second dose insurance, perhaps, against Lettuce talking. Lettuce needed the revolver to remove Anne once the money was secure. Each believed the other the greater threat. Craddock gestured to the typewriter. The suicide note? Typed by Anne on the vicarage machine, she borrowed it for parish circulars. Copied in the colonel's hand by Lettuce, who had practiced his signature on checks since childhood. The ruled paper was a mistake. The colonel despised ruled paper. He wrote on plain and drew his own lines. Anne's shoulders sagged. He was going to confess everything to the police after the funeral. He told me so that afternoon. I drugged his whiskey, shot him, locked the door from outside with the pliers we keep for the wine crates. Lettuce watched from the passage. Lettuce lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. I wrote the warning note and hid it in the confessional. I thought if the priest was frightened into silence. He was already dead, Anne said. I poisoned the coffee on Tuesday morning. Gladys left the tray in the vestry. I added the cyanide while she fetched Father's stole. 10 seconds, no more. Craddock made a note. And the first Mrs. Prothero? Anne's eyes filled. Lucius told Father Brennan the whole story, arsenic in the curry. The ayah bribed, the doctor paid. He thought absolution would quiet his conscience. It only signed his death warrant. Miss Marple moved to the window. Dawn was breaking, a pale wash of rose over the frost-rimed lawns. In Simla, 30 years ago, a child of 15 listened at keyholes. She learned that money could be bought with silence, and silence with murder. The pattern repeated itself, only the victims changed. Lettice dropped her cigarette into the hearth. "What happens now?" "You will be charged with murder and conspiracy to murder," Craddock said. "Both of you." The constables led them away. Anne walked with her head high, as though still mistress of the house. Lettice stumbled, the scarlet scarf trailing like a noose. The study door closed behind them. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "The white feather?" A reminder from Lettice to Anne cowardice if she faltered. "It was found on the blotter the day I took tea." Anne destroyed the blue letter that accompanied Lettice's ultimatum. "And the scratched wing of the Daimler?" Lettice drove to the vicarage on Monday night to type the suicide note. She misjudged the gatepost in the dark. Craddock closed his notebook. "You might have told me the trap was here, not in the church." "My dear Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "murderers return to the scene of their crime. The church was the bait, the manor was the snare, and now the pattern is complete." She walked with him to the front door. The frost was melting. Rooks wheeled above the elms, their cries sharp in the cold air. The Polish maid stood in the hall, wringing her apron, tears on her cheeks. "Poor man," she whispered. "Poor ladies." Miss Marple patted her arm. "Poor indeed. But justice is not always merciful." Outside, the police car waited. Craddock handed Miss Marple into the front seat for the short drive to the station. Protocol could be stretched for an old lady who had just solved 2 murders. As they passed the churchyard, she glanced at the fresh mounds Father Brennan's grave, already settling, the colonel's raw earth beside it. 2 Tuesdays, she murmured, and an All Souls' Eve. The dead have their calendar, Inspector, and we ignore it at our peril. Craddock started the engine. "Will you give evidence at the trial?" "If I am spared," she said. "Though I dare say the typewriter and the pliers will speak louder than I." The car moved off down the lane. Behind them, the old manor house stood silent, its windows blind in the morning light. The laurels shivered in the wind, and somewhere a door banged once, as though the house itself sighed and settled into emptiness. Chapter 8. The Quiet Returns. The double funeral was held on a morning of thin November sunshine that laid a pale blessing across the churchyard. 2 coffins, side by side, rested on trestles beneath the yew. Father Brennan's plain oak with a silver crucifix. Colonel Prothero's polished mahogany, draped in the Union Jack from his regiment. The curate, Mr. Clement, read the service in a voice steadier than before. The lesson was from the book of Job, "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away." A small congregation attended. Dr. Haydock, Inspector Craddock in mufti, the verger Hawes, a handful of villagers who had known both men since childhood. Anne and Lettice were absent, held in Holloway awaiting trial. The Polish maid stood at the back, clutching a rosary, her face swollen with weeping. Miss Marple took her usual place near the font. She wore black kid gloves and a veil that softened the sharp November light. When the coffins were lowered, one beside the colonel's first wife, the other in the priest's corner, she did not throw earth, but placed a single white chrysanthemum on each mound. The flowers looked frail against the dark soil, yet they endured. Afterwards, the village dispersed quietly. No one lingered for tea at the vicarage. The new priest, a shy young man from Dorset, had not yet arrived. Miss Marple walked home past the war memorial, where old Mr. Pauk was sweeping fallen leaves into neat piles. "Sad business, miss," he said, touching his cap. "Very sad, Mr. Pauk, but the village will heal." She let herself into her cottage, hung up her coat, and set a kettle on the hob. The post had brought a letter from her nephew Raymond in London news of his wife's pregnancy, a request for the recipe for damson jam. She laid it aside to answer later. On the mantelpiece stood the tin that had held the white feather, the pressed violet, the scrap of paper. She had returned them to Inspector Craddock as exhibits. The room felt larger without them. At noon Dr. Haydock called with a jar of his housekeeper's piccalilli. "Thought you might need cheering," he said. "Though you look remarkably serene." Miss Marple accepted the jar. Serenity comes when the pattern is complete, Doctor. 2 deaths, 2 murderers, 1 old sin. The wheel has turned full circle. Haydock filled his pipe. The trial will be ugly. Arsenic in Simla, cyanide in the coffee, a staged suicide. The newspapers will feast. Let them, she said. Truth is rarely pretty, but it is clean. He glanced at her knitting now, a finished jacket, pale yellow, awaiting buttons. You'll be called as a witness. I expect so, though the typewriter ribbon will tell more than I can. Haydock knocked out his pipe. How did you know about the first wife? In Simla, 30 years ago, a Major Prothero was acquitted for lack of evidence. The ayah swore the Memsahib died of fever, but ayahs remember. And so do little English girls who overhear servants' gossip in the bazaar. She folded the jacket neatly. Lettuce was that girl. She carried the knowledge like a burr until it served her purpose. Haydock rose. You might have told Craddock sooner. My dear doctor, said Miss Marple, some truths are safer in a confessional than in a courtroom. But murder will out-even in St. Mary Mead. He left with a gruff nod. Miss Marple lunched on bread and cheese, then walked to the church to arrange the altar flowers' white chrysanthemums again, in memory. The confessional curtain had been removed for cleaning. The lattice stood bare, innocent. She paused before it, then moved on. In the afternoon, Inspector Craddock telephoned from Much Benham. Anne has confessed everything. Lettuce is holding out, but the typewriter matches, and the pliers have her prints. It's over. Thank you, Inspector. You have been most patient. He laughed. I've learned from the best. Will you take tea when I'm next in the village? I should be delighted. She hung up and returned to her sitting room. The fire burned brightly. Outside, the frost had melted into soft mist. She took up her knitting, once more a scarf this time, in soft gray wool and counted stitches with the calm of one who has set a tangled skein to rights. By evening, the village had settled into its old rhythm. The baker's van made its rounds. Children played hopscotch on the pavement. Mrs. Price Ridley called on Miss Weatherby to dissect the funerals. No one spoke of locked doors or poisoned coffee. The dead were buried. The living resumed their dance. Miss Marple finished the scarf, cast off, and laid it aside. She opened her Bible at random and read, Behold, I show you a mystery. Then she closed the book, drew the curtains against the dusk, and sat in the lamplight, her hands idle for once. The quiet had returned to St. Mary Mead, but it was a different quiet lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from the air. Somewhere a clock struck 6. The sound floated across the fields, clear and unhurried. Miss Marple smiled to herself. In the great pattern of human affairs, justice was a small stitch, but it held the fabric together. And tomorrow there would be damson jam to make, and a baby jacket to post to London, and the ordinary, blessed business of living. She rose, banked the fire, and went to bed. The wind had dropped. The stars were out. St. Mary Mead slept, and Miss Marple with it, dreaming not of murder, but of gardens in spring, where even the yew trees put forth new green.